Welcome to Takeshi's Bench, where you can discuss all things philosophical. This is the third episode of Japanese Philosophy for Beginners. In the first two episodes, we talked about the framework in which we can study the history of Japanese philosophy, and we also talked about the structural problems that we have in accommodating history of Japanese philosophy in the context of academic philosophy. Now, from this episode onwards, I would like to talk about the content of the history of Japanese philosophy. My idea is to introduce each thinkers and traditions that are introduced in the source book. And the first thinker that the source book talks about is the Prince Shotoku. So in this episode, I would like to talk about Prince Shotoku. The first thinker the source book refers to as the first thinker of the Japanese philosophical tradition. He's a very important thinker in relation to the intellectual history of Japan, but I would like to particularly focus on the concept that he talks about in his famous text in this episode. And the concept is wa. This is a very important term in Japanese language because sometimes we use this term to talk about the new era. We have the new emperor in Japan, therefore we have to have a new era. And last year we started this new era called Reiwa. The part of the new era, Reiwa, has this term wa. Also, this term is used to describe anything has a Japanese flavor or Japanese style. So when we talk about something as being done in Japanese style, we call wafu the wa style. That means the Japanese style. Or we can talk about Japanese restaurant, Japanese food as washoku. So it is the dinner that is done in the style of wa. So this term carries this cultural connotation of being Japanese. Therefore, this term is very important for understanding the history of Japanese philosophy. But the first thinker that talked about this concept is actually Prince Shotoku. So in this episode, I would like to talk about this concept of wa introduced in one of the texts written by Prince Shotoku. And then finally, I would like to talk about why do we need to talk about this concept of wa, especially for some of us who are non-Japanese. Right? We are interested in Japanese culture from outsider, and then we can talk about wa. But then we are also interested in philosophy. So philosophical implication of the culturally specific concept. So we have to ask this question of why is this important, or how is it significant for those of us who do not live in Japan or who do not speak Japanese language, but we are interested in Japanese philosophy. So in this episode, I'd like to briefly introduce who Prince Shotoku is, the concept of wa that he came up with, and then we discuss the philosophical significance of that concept. Okay, Prince Shotoku. This is the image of Prince Shotoku based on the description that provided in some texts. He is known in Japanese as Shotoku Taishi, who lived between 574 to 622. So he's a 6th, 7th century philosopher from Asuka period. This is a historical period of Japan called Asuka period, which was between 538 to 710. But it comes with a question mark. Why? I'll explain the following. Now, if you look at the history of Japan, you have these different historical periods. Shotoku Taishi comes from Asuka period, and then it is followed by Nara period between 710 to 794. And then you have Heian period, which goes from 794 to 1185. And then famous Kamakura period starts in 12th century, 1185 to 1333, so on and so forth. Now, these historical periods in Japan are generally objectifiable or scientifically verifiable after Nara period. What do I mean by this? Now, we have to know about the history of Japan to talk about Asuka period and the significance of Shotoku Taishi in this historical time, because the first extant text on the history of Japan is Kojiki, an account of ancient matters written by Ono Yasumaro. This text was written in 712. The first record of history of Japan is written in the beginning of 8th century. And then second text is Nihongi or Nihon Shoki. It's the Chronicles of Japan from the earlier times to 697 AD. Now supposedly the author of this Nihon Shoki or Nihongi is Toneri Shinno. And this is written in 720. They are the most complete extant record of ancient Japan, and they are quite influential in the rest of the Japanese history. And also they are very important for knowing Japanese culture, or at least a huge chunk of it. In addition to the source book, you should have Kojiki and Nihon Shoki or Nihongi in your bookshelf if you're interested in studying Japanese philosophy. Now, there are the basis in which we construct any historical narrative before the beginning of 8th century. That is to say, anything after 712 or 720 are something that we know of, well, something that we have a record of, but anything before that, we have to take it into account that they are narrated from the perspective from following historical periods. So, in fact, Kojiki and Nihon Shoki are written almost 90 years after the death of Shotoku Taishi. So the facticity of the narrative about this character or this thinker is always up to question. Therefore, we even have controversial argument about the beginning and end of Asuka period. So you have to keep that in mind. In fact, in Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, Shotoku Taishi is referred as a different name. Prince Shotoku was called Toyotomimi or Umayado no Mikoto in these texts from 8th century. This is interesting because Toyotomimi has this description of someone really smart, but he has the character of rich, comprehensive, clear hearing ears. That's a Toyotomimi. Mimi means ears in Japanese language. And Umayado no Mikoto means somebody who is born in horse stable. There are some arguments that maybe the birth of Shotoku Taishi is borrowed from the birth of Jesus in a Judeo-Christian tradition, but most scholars argue that this is just coincidence. But it's interesting that he was actually born in a horse stable. There's some humility in the legend of Prince Shotoku's birth, Umayado no Mikoto, or sometimes he's called Umayado no Oji. Okay, but because of this historical narrative that describes the Shotoku Taishi or Prince Shotoku after Nara period onwards, Shotoku Taishi is a name that we gave him after the death of Umayado no Mikoto or Toyotomimi. So we have to separate historical person of Toyotomimi or Umayado no Oji and Shotoku Taishi, but also it's not possible to separate them completely because our understanding of the historical character is saturated with legends and narratives that shaped Japanese culture and language. So often, he's known among the Japanese people with this legend of the Great Listening. This legend tells us that 10 people came to him to talk about lawsuits. So I'm having this problem, I'm having this problem, I'm having this problem. 10 people started to talk to him at the same time, and he was able to decipher every single word of 10 people's request at the same time, or 10 people's appeals at the same time. That's the legend of Great Listening. And if you talk to any Japanese person or person who knows Shotoku Taishi, they will probably know this legend of the Great Listening. And again, Toyotomimi, right? It literally means rich, clear hearing of a ear, right? Mimi. Apparently, this just means that someone is really bright. So someone being bright in ancient Japanese and Chinese context is to mean that someone who is capable of listening. So probably this legend is exaggerated out of this Toyotomimi description. And in fact, there are so many fables in Buddhist traditions that have some similar description of someone being smart or someone being enlightened. So this legend of Great Listening, we have no idea whether or not it actually happened in the past, but it has this connection with the name Toyotomimi. Another famous characteristics of Prince Shotoku is that he is considered to be the founder of Japanese Buddhism and also someone who imported the Confucian tradition from continental East Asia. Now, the recent historical investigations of this person, Toyotomimi or Umayado no Oji, argues that he cannot be the founder of Japanese Buddhism, as the many Japanese school textbooks talk about Prince Shotoku as the founder of Japanese Buddhism, and apparently Ministry of Education knows this, and we are still teaching our children with this notion of Shotoku Taishi as the founder of Japanese Buddhism or someone who imported the Chinese culture into the history of Japan, right? So you have this argument about historical description of Prince Shotoku and then historical narrative that describes who he is. There's some discrepancy between these two camps. But I think it's important to keep in mind that anything that we talk about before the Nara period has some elements of conjectures and fictionality, which is not a loss for the Japanese culture because if you think about it, 12th century Shinran, the famous Japanese philosopher and founder of Pure Land Shin Buddhism in Japan in the medieval period, he's one of the leading figures in Kamakura Buddhism. He actually worshipped Shotoku Taishi as the founder of Japanese Buddhism. In fact, there's a book written on this topic, The Prince and the Monk, Shotoku Worship and Shinran's Buddhism, Kenneth Do-Young Lee from SUNY University Press. So Japanese culture constructed this notion of Shotoku Taishi, or this image of Shotoku Taishi, on top of the historical figure of Umayado no Mikoto. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the Japanese conception of Shotoku Taishi has more than just the historical facts, and they are influential for the constitution of Japanese culture in the rest of the Japanese history. So not only Shinran from Kamakura period, you have Shotoku Taishi in the money. So 1930s, Shotoku Taishi showed up in a 100 yen bill in 1930s, and it was printed twice before the end of the war. And then he made it to the 1,000 yen in 1950s, and then he immediately made it to the 5,000 yen in 1954, I think. And then he also made it to 10,000 yen bill, which is the biggest bill that you can have in Japanese economy. Now, these bills are printed from 1930s up until 1984, which means Shotoku Taishi represents both the bad times, right? Bad times meaning between mid-1930s until the end of the World War II, and even after the World War II, Japanese economy is devastated, right? So you have this horrible time in terms of economy, and then he made it to the 10,000 yen bill in the good times, which is the Japanese economic miracle between 1950 to 1980s. So if you talk to anybody who is 50 plus in Japanese society, they will remember Shotoku Taishi on their bills. He's very famous for that generation. Now, I asked my Japanese nephew, who is 8 years old, and I asked him, do you know Shotoku Taishi? And he said, what the heck is that? So the younger generation might not know as much as the older generation. But this is another case you can see how Shotoku Taishi, or the image of Shotoku Taishi, is very important for the Japanese culture. Not only in economy, but also Shotoku Taishi has influential presence in Japanese legal system, at least as a cultural figure. 1950s Japanese government requested this famous painter from Kyoto, Domoto Insho, to paint 3 portraits of Prince Shotoku. And they placed in the main courtroom of the Supreme Court between 1950s and 1970s, before they moved to the new courthouse. And in the latest courthouse, they placed these portraits in the library. So the Supreme Court judge, prosecutors, and lawyers that go to this court, all of them actually see the image of Prince Shotoku. So he is considered to be an important figure, even for the specialist of contemporary Japanese law. So let's take a look at the major works of Shotoku Taishi and see how the concept of wa appears therein. The first collection of texts written by Shotoku Taishi are commentaries on Buddhist Sutra. They are called Sangyo Gisho. They basically are the compilation of his commentaries on 3 sutras. Now it seems that we can verify 2 sutra out of 3 are actually written by Shotoku Taishi, and one of them supposedly survived. And another famous work by Prince Shotoku is called Jushichijo Kenpo, the 17-article constitution, or often known as the Shotoku Constitution. And I would like to talk about this Jushichijo Kenpo. But before going into that, I would like to show you this Sangyo Gisho. One of them is called Hokke Gyogisho, which is a commentary of Lotus Sutra. Supposedly that text survived, and this is supposedly the calligraphy of Prince Shotoku, and it plays an important role in the history of calligraphy. And in this episode, I'd like to focus on the 17th-article Jushichijo Kenpo, or the Shotoku Constitution. This is where Prince Shotoku talks about the notion of wa. Let's take a look at this constitution. It's quite short. It is recorded in Nihon Shoki, or Nihongi Book 22, which is published in Suiko 12 or 604 Common Era. Now, what is Suiko 12? Suiko is the name of empress from 7th century Japan. She's the 33rd monarch of Japan and also the first empress of Japanese imperial house. So Suiko Tenno, or Empress Suiko. In her time, in 12th year of her reign, Shotoku Constitution was written by Prince Shotoku. Now the Shotoku Constitution looks something like this. It's written all in sinographs. And if you know somebody who can actually read these ancient Japanese texts and only in sinographs, you need to keep in touch with that person, because that person probably knows about Japanese culture more than anybody else. Also ancient Chinese culture, so you do not lose the contact with somebody who can read these ancient Japanese texts or sinographs as they are. Now, they have to be translated into Japanese for the contemporary Japanese reader. So it looks something like this. It's called yomikudashi. It just spells out the ways in which we should read these texts written in sinographs. They're not Chinese, but Chinese characters are used to describe Japanese language. So you have to translate the reading of sinographs into contemporary Japanese. Now, even if you give this yomikudashi, which is the right side of this version, most Japanese person would not be able to understand what it says. You still have to translate that yomikudashi bun into contemporary Japanese language. So let me briefly read this yomikudashi, or the ways in which you read Jushichijo Kenpo, and I would like to pay attention to the first two articles, and that's enough. So we're going to pay attention to the first two articles, and let me read it to give you the sound of the constitution, which is quite different from contemporary Japanese language. And then we can skip all these technical problems by looking at English translation. That's the beauty of reading the translation, right? That all the heavy interpretive work is done by scholars, so we will be able to actually digest the meaning of the text. That's fantastic, right? So this is the first article. 一に曰く、和らぎをもって尊しとし、逆うるなきを胸とせよ。人胸田村あり、また悟れるもの少なし、あるいは訓布に従わず、また倫理にたがう。されども神和らぎ、死も結びて、ことをあげつらうに叶うときは、すなわち自利おのずから通ず、何事かならざん。So, you notice immediately here, wa, the character wa happens here. The first article, wa をもって尊しとなし。That's probably how most Japanese people read this sentence. But in actual reading of the text, you have to read it as yawaragi. Yawaragi o motte totoshi to nashi. So wa is read as yawaragi, but in the history of Japanese culture, people started to read them as wa. Nini iwaku, that's the second article. 熱く散歩を敬え。散歩とは仏、のり、奉仕なり。すなわち四章のよりどころ、万国の大宗なり。いずれの世、いずれの人がこの方を尊ばぜらん。人、甚だあしきもの少なし。よく押しうるをもって従う。それ散歩により祭らずんば。何をもってか曲がれるを正さん。Okay, so if you talk to someone who speaks Japanese, they have no idea what I just said. So let's take a look at the English translation to digest what it actually means. So the first article says this: take harmony to be of the highest value and take cooperation to be what is most honored. 和をもって尊しとなし or 和らぎをもって尊しとなし says that take harmony to be the highest value and take cooperation to be what is most honored. So immediately Prince Shotoku puts this concept of wa or yawaragi as the central value to be valued. Now, I have to mention something. When you say Jushichijo Kenpo or the Shotoku Constitution, this is different from contemporary conception of constitution. Modern constitution describes the relationship between government and the people. But Jushichijo Kenpo is written more like a moral code for people who work at the government. So even though we use the same term constitution, they do not the same thing. Now when we talk about Kenpo Kyujo, which is the 9th article of modern Japanese constitution, this is a huge discussion taking place in Japanese politics right now. That Kenpo Kyujo and Jushichijo Kenpo are completely different nature, but Japanese people use the same term Kenpo to describe constitution. You need to keep that in mind. So let's go back to the notion of yawaragi. And then he says this after take this notion of harmony to be the highest value. He says, all persons are partisan. A few indeed are sufficiently broad-minded. Broad-minded here means something like someone who will be able to see the comprehensive picture of the whole thing. You know, people usually have different affiliations and favors. You like one team rather than another. You belong to one group rather than another. And then most people won't be able to see the comprehensive picture of where this whole thing is heading toward. It is for this reason that some offend against Lord and Father and some transgress wantonly against neighboring villagers. Right? So we have these favoritism. And because of that, we tend to transgress relationship between yourself and your family members or your relationship between you and government, so on and so forth, right? But when those above are harmonious and those below live congenially with each other, and when mutual accord prevails in resolving the affairs of the day, then all matters without exception will be properly and effectively dispatched. Now, I don't quite agree with the last part of this translation. By the way, this translation is provided in the source book. Prince Shotoku says basically something like, if we keep the harmonious relationship, everything would become reasonable, and then there's nothing that we cannot achieve. That's literally what he says. It's a little bit more rigid translation here, but that's the basic gist. So keep the harmony, keep in mind that the people tend to favor one thing over the other, and as long as we do this, we can achieve anything we want, and everything will be reasonable. That's the basic gist of the first article. The second article says something like this: revere in earnest the three treasures, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the clergy. For these are the final refuge of all sentient beings and are most sacred and honored objects in the faith of all nations. Now, the term clergy includes the gathering of the people. So like the gathering of people, Dharma, and the Buddha. For these are the final refuge for all living things and are most sacred and honored objects in the faith of all nations. What persons in what age would fail to cherish this Dharma? There are few persons who are truly wicked. Most can be instructed and brought into the fold. Without preparing to these three treasures, when can the crook be made straight? So what do they mean, right? Let's take a summary of these two articles of the Shotoku Constitution. So wa or yawaragi means harmony. But what kind of harmony is Shotoku Taishi talking about? He basically says respect difference and diversity. We have to respect the fact that people have different likes and dislikes and there are belongings, right? Affiliations are different from each other, and this is the reason why we tend to make these transgressions. So respect that difference and try to keep the harmony. And also he introduces the religious and cultural pluralism. Now, in the ancient Japanese religious tradition, there was only Shintoism, right? Shinto native tradition. And then you have Buddhism that carried over from continental East Asia. And Shotoku Taishi is basically arguing that we should respect these Buddhist teaching and putting the Buddhist notion of the Buddha and Dharma into the center of moral teaching in Japanese cultural context at the time, right? So respect different religious and cultural traditions, and then introduces this harmony of Buddhism and Shintoism and Confucianism in this context. So he is telling all the government officials, the people who work for the emperor, to embrace Buddhism, Confucianism, and Shintoism, right? And also talks about this openness to the continental East Asia. Remember that he talks about all nations. So he's not just talking about moral teaching for people within the cultural context of Japan, but he's saying that this concept of Dharma is universal and something that we should cherish, and we should use it as a basis in which we correct evilness. And nobody is evil enough not to be cured, his argument, right? So he introduces this sort of multicultural perspective, but also very international and universal perspective of the Buddhist ideal. So that's the original concept of harmony or wa that we can observe in the Shotoku Constitution. Now we have to keep in mind that wa or harmony often carries both positive and negative connotation in contemporary Japanese language. Why? Because look, the harmony can be used to argue against the difference and diversity too, right? In 1930s and 1945, Shotoku Taishi was on the face of the 100 yen bill. But do you think the people actually use this concept of harmony or wa to appreciate differences of opinions and diversity or religious and cultural pluralism? Absolutely no, right? That's why sometimes harmony has this connotation of killing the individual differences, or unique perspective need to be harmonized into the whole. So even in a contemporary Japanese language, sometimes we talk about wa as a negative connotation, and there are many intellectual specialists talk about reiwa. The new Japanese era usually means something like a goodness, and yawaragi, the harmony or calmness. But sometimes we can see rei as this ordering to become harmonious, that is to kill the individual differences and uniqueness that did actually take place in the course of contemporary Japanese history from 1930s to 1980s, as you see Shotoku Taishi on the Japanese bill. So you have to keep in mind that the harmony can be used in both positive and negative way, and also the fact that the Shotoku Taishi didn't use it in a negative way. In fact, he seemed to suggest that we should respect differences in diversity by incorporating continental East Asian culture and also hold this harmonious relationship between different religious and cultural traditions. Okay, so let's take that notion of wa or yawaragi to the contemporary philosophical concept by asking this question of why is the notion of wa is important for non-Japanese thinkers like us. So how can we contextualize this notion of wa in the present? That this is the character of wa? We have to think about this COVID-19 situation, the world pandemic that we are going through right now, right? And this is precisely in a situation that the notion of what becomes meaningful, I think. In present society, wherever you are in the world, we suffer from these two poles, or we suffer from the swing between these two poles. One side, we want to embrace this ideal of open societies. So I'm living in Europe right now, and you can see the European Union. The notion of open borders, open society is this democratic ideal, right? The societies in which people can move from one place to another freely, and also you're free to express your individuality. That's the notion of open society. But that was precisely the basis on which we could spread the COVID-19 so fast around the world. And you've seen all the nations inside the EU going through these lockdowns, right? So all the borders are closed to prevent people from moving from one place to another and contain them into different places. So you have this idealism of continuing the path of European Union, open society, and we can also talk about this relationship between EU and Japan. We want to keep this open communication between these two international organizations. But then we have to shut down the airport and we have to stop the people from coming in and spreading the infection. Harmony is basically the notion that indicates the togetherness of difference. That is to say, we don't have to suffer from either or. It's not either open society and lockdowns, but we can actually practice both. That is to say, yeah, we want to hold on to the ideal of open societies where we appreciate differences in individual uniqueness. We don't have to sacrifice those as you go through lockdowns. We suddenly started to hear this notion of we can be together apart. Have you ever heard that expression? You don't have to be alone in the lockdowns. You can actually share knowledge. You can reach out to make communications with the people such that even if you have to stay inside one location, you can still communicate with other people and share the knowledge and share the opinions and share the emotions, right? So the idea of both and packed in the notion of harmony can be practiced in contemporary society. Sometimes Japanese philosophers talk about this notion of betweenness. So it's not either open society or lockdowns, but we operate in between these two oppositions. That is the harmony or the togetherness of difference, or aida, betweenness in Japanese language. That happens in contemporary philosophical context. So it is something to think about. Wa is not just Japanese concept applicable to Japanese people, or anything that is done in Japanese style can be called wa. No, Shotoku Taishi is saying that this notion of wa can be practiced anywhere. Like Buddhism, it is the basis for peace and prosperity of all nations. So he has very internationalized perspective of the world, and a universal concept of harmony can be practiced in different cultural contexts. So in a way, wa can be practiced in your country, in Brazil, Colombia, Spain, Belgium, France, Germany, United States, or Canada, all the countries that I have my friends living in, Iran, Ecuador. There are different ways in which wa can be practiced. So perhaps wa has this universal structure that can be culturally contextualized or particularized in different parts of the world. So I would like to see how this concept can be applied and practiced in different parts of the world. And by doing this, we will be able to cherish this distance, but with some sort of togetherness. And in that betweenness or the separation, we might be able to bloom something beautiful that we can call wa in cross-cultural and international context. Okay, on that note, I'd like to finish this episode. If you made it this far, you should definitely like this video. And also, if you're interested in philosophy, please subscribe to this channel, Takeshi's Bench. If you have any questions about philosophy or comments, arguments, and ideas on all things philosophical, please feel free to send them to us through comments. We will try to pick some of them for the future episodes. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.